Richard, it's good to see you. It's wonderful to spend some time with you today.
Good to see you, John.
Richard, you recently published a paper in Trends in Immunology, and you've identified in this paper some new concepts of multiple sclerosis pathogenesis. Can you elaborate on some of these new concepts?
So MS was first described as a distinctive neurological condition, different from all other diseases, over 150 years ago. Even then, the first people who reported that MS was a distinct condition noticed that early on, patients had episodes of neurological symptoms, which usually went away, but that later on, they slowly and steadily got worse. And this was one of the features that was so unusual that it made them believe MS is a different disease unto itself. From that time until now, we have actually used that same sort of descriptive framework to talk about MS. Early on, we talk about people having something called relapsing remitting MS. Later on, we talk about progressive MS. Altogether, we talk about relapsing remitting MS and progressive MS as though they are really separate things. In fact, these terms are useful for talking about the clinical course, but they're purely descriptive. They don't imply any mechanisms. They don't tell us what's going on underneath the hood. They don't explain how patients experience this symptomatic worsening or how they become disabled. So it's an important recent development that the field has recognized that these purely descriptive terms, particularly insofar as they're used by regulatory agencies, can actually slow us down in our attempts to get the best therapies to people with MS, particularly during this progressive phase later in the disease. Ultimately, the reason why we have to talk about mechanisms is that therapies treat mechanisms.
So, Richard, that's fascinating. I mean, have new concepts emerged to improve the communication about how clinical symptoms relate ultimately to mechanism?
Yeah, I think we really have hit on a way of talking with each other that is widely used and begins to make sense. What we speak of now is the clinical symptoms in a way that implies the underlying mechanisms. What we talk about is relapsing pathology producing relapse activity. And this relapse activity can be described in two different ways, either as clinical symptoms or as brand new lesions showing up on the magnetic resonance imaging or MRI scans of the patient's brain. On the other side, we talk about progressive pathology, and this causes a clinical manifestation that we really haven't noticed before and is, I think, extremely important. We talk about progression independent of relapse activity, or PIRA. This is people getting slowly and steadily worse, even when their MRI scan doesn't seem to show any changes, and even when they haven't had clinical attacks. And I think the key concept here is that patients experience both relapse activity and PIRA throughout the entire disease course. So we're not talking about one type of disease called relapsing that changes into another called progressive. We're talking about two processes that go on at the same time in every patient, or almost every patient, let's say. So PIRA really is the unmet medical need in people with MS because it is not successfully treated by the current therapies. The current therapies are fantastic against relapse activity, but not against PIRA. So it has been an education for me and for the field at large to come to realize that PIRA is occurring even in patients that get these high efficacy therapies and even in patients who have just begun their journey with MS.
That's really interesting, Richard. I mean, obviously, it's so important for patients and the emergence of new therapies as well. Can you say a few words on the mechanisms that underlie relapse activity and also PIRA?
Relapse activity is clearly driven by the occasional entry of autoimmune white blood cells called T cells, B cells, and monocytes into the brain or spinal cord. We have extremely effective treatments for this relapse activity, even though we don't fully understand why it happens when it happens, but we certainly know how to treat it. The reason it's so clear that the driving force for relapse activity comes from cells in the circulation is because we can treat it successfully with agents including what are called biologics, including therapeutic antibodies that only act towards cells in the circulation. They don't get in to the CNS. So PIRA, on the mechanism level, is associated with inflammatory autoimmune processes, just like relapse activity. But the difference is that in PIRA, these processes are completely compartmentalized within the CNS. That's one reason the biologics don't work against PIRA, because they don't enter the CNS. If we look under the microscope at the neuropathology level, this progressive pathology, just like the relapse activity, it has an inflammatory driver, but here the inflammatory driver is collections of the same autoimmune white blood cells, but now they're not in the circulation anymore. They have come to live within a part of the central nervous system called the meninges, which is where the spinal fluid is made and circulates. This inflammatory driver, these cells in the meninges, causes two different forms of ongoing tissue injury. Demyelination of the cerebral cortex, the gray matter, and demyelination of the white matter. And this demyelination of the white matter becomes very, very chronic and goes on. A single lesion can last for as many as 7, 8, 10 years. All of MS involves damage to myelin, which is the fatty covering around nerve fibers that helps them conduct efficiently. It's like an insulator. Now, why haven't we noticed PIRA? Why haven't we noticed these types of pathology? How did they all fly under the radar and escape our attention for so many years? The reason is partly that PIRA is rather subtle, and another part is that conventional MRI brain scans do not detect that type of tissue injury. So when the neurologist doesn't see anything changing on the brain scan and the patient says, I'm not sure if I'm better or worse, the neurologist tends to think things are going okay. So if we sort of tie this together, MS patients, even early in disease and even under therapy with incredibly effective agents that stop relapse pathology, are undergoing PIRA. And then if we look under the hood at the mechanism, we see that these meningeal aggregates of inflammatory autoimmune white blood cells cause demyelination in the gray matter and the white matter. And we believe that that is what contributes to PIRA.
Help explain the relevance of these new findings to some of the approaches that Abata is progressing in their MS program, and what gives you optimism about Abata's approach in light of this understanding of mechanism?
It's that we have not only got new ideas, we have new tools. The conventional MRI just doesn't see progressive pathology in action. So it's really hard to tell what's going on with the patient because it's slow, it's subtle, and you don't have any indicator on the brain scan that it's happening. Now, about 4 years ago, our scientific advisor at Abata, Daniel Wright, who heads up the MS imaging unit at NIH and uses the MRI scanner to investigate the mechanisms underlying MS. He reported a technique for imaging these chronic active demyelinating white matter lesions. The term that he used for this type of lesion is kind of long, paramagnetic rim lesion. And so we decided to just call them PRLs. Sometimes we call them pearls because we think they're really valuable. What Dr. Reich showed is that these PRL lesions are present in about 55% of all MS patients, that they are associated with a worse clinical course, and that they are not responsive to the therapies that control the relapse pathology. So put that all together, these characteristics are consistent with our idea that PRLs are part of the cause for PIRA symptomatic worsening. The PRL technology is incredibly game-changing for clinical development in patients because for the first time we can see, in quotes, the underlying pathology in a living patient. Now, even before launch, Abata was thinking about these concepts, and we were convinced that the PRL technology could be transformative. In fact, we proposed right at the get-go that we would select patients for inclusion in our clinical trials based on the presence of PRLs. This way, we can identify and treat patients who are the most likely to be able to benefit from our treatment, because what we're trying to do with our therapy is disperse and disable these meningeal inflammatory aggregates. I lived through the entire evolution of treatment for the relapse activity of MS, from nothing at all to really highly effective. I saw a similar process at that time because it was the MRI used to detect newly forming lesions that really made the difference in developing therapies for the relapse activity in MS. We think the PRL technique has the same potential to transform our treatment development for progressive pathology. So you ask, why am I optimistic? We have a game-changing tool. And ever since our MS program was first proposed about 3 years ago, the evidence has just piled up and up and up that has strengthened and heightened our excitement about bringing this Treg therapy to MS patients.
So, Richard, is it fair to say we have a better understanding of disease mechanism? We have some new tools for detection, and we, of course, have a promising new therapy. Maybe take it up 40,000 feet and summarize it for me in sort of more simple terms.
I think the first point to make is that if you don't know the enemy, you're in big trouble. I think we have finally identified the enemy in why people with MS still undergo this progressive disease, even though we've covered and controlled relapse pathology so well. And so, this concept of PIRA and the identification of it, that's point number one. We know the enemy now. Point number two is not just to identify the enemy, but to understand the enemy. And I think our insight into the mechanisms that underlie PIRA and progressive pathology is advanced light years ahead of where we used to be. And then number three, we have this technology to identify and follow in living patients what's going on at the pathological level using the MRI scanner. That's what changed the game before. I think that's what's going to change the game again. So the last point I want to make, I really do want to bring this back to Abata, is these remarkable developments in cell therapy, in understanding Tregs, and ultimately the achievements that Abata has brought to fruition just in its short life in manufacturing our cell product and getting it ready to go to the clinic. So we're very excited as we move towards our first in-human trial.
Well, that does sound extremely exciting, and certainly bodes very well for Abata's efforts overall with this really innovative approach. Richard, it's been a delight to talk to you about all this, and wonderful to spend some time with you today.
John, it's been my pleasure as well, and I really thank you for your time.